welcome Dr. Eben Alexander.
Thank you so much. Hello, good evening. Can you hear me out there? Always got to check. Well, it's a real joy to be here. I've talked in Houston a few times in the past, but I think this is by quite a bit the largest crowd that I've enjoyed here. And thank you all for coming out. Also want to put out a special thanks to Hadley Walker, who a local girl, done fine. She's helped me tremendously, Hadley. I appreciate everything you've done for all of my journey and certainly for bringing me here to Houston. So thank you. To tell my story that as I want to tell it tonight, I need to see a show of hands. You will not be graded on this, but I want to see how many people have not read the book Proof of Heaven. Just raise your hand. Okay. Well, little spoiler alert. Going to be going into some things there that I think make that book pretty powerful and resonant with a lot of souls around this world. And so I'll be spilling a little bit of that, but believe me, there's plenty in the book that I won't have time to get into tonight. But likewise, I'll be getting into some things that just flat out are not in the book. Now, to see the kind of arc of my personal journey here, I think it's very important to see who I was before. And I grew up in a Methodist church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My father had tremendous influence on my course in life, and he had grown up during the Depression. He was a combat surgeon in the Pacific in the Second World War, and he had a strong religious belief. He had gotten that from his family and his upbringing in eastern Tennessee. And so for him, in spite of all the brutality and hardship that he saw during a year and a half overseas, the Second World War, I think it was his strong faith in God and an infinitely powerful and loving God that got him through that relatively unscathed. Now, he was also very much scientific. He ended up becoming chairman of a neurosurgical training program. I grew up in a home where Scientific American, the monthly journal, was lying around, and I would read it cover to cover. I always knew that science is the pathway to truth. I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been. I also came to realize after my coma journey that happened about 5.5 years ago that the science of what's called reductive materialism, that's our conventional science today, which says that if you reduce everything down to the workings of electrons, protons, quarks, subatomic physics, then chemistry, biology, build up the atoms and molecules and cells of the brain and everything else, that you can explain all there is to explain about reality. And I bought that hook, line, and sinker. And I believed it religiously. I worshipped that science. But I now know, and my coma journey showed me in no uncertain terms, that pure materialism in science, it basically says that consciousness is an illusion. That science would try and tell you that none of us have free will. In fact, there's the kind of default position in modern neuroscience is that free will is a complete illusion, that no one has that at all. They would say that it's just those subatomic workings of those subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, cells of the brain. Consciousness is an illusion. Pay it no mind. And that's what I bought into, hook, line, and sinker, for a very long time, that the brain creates consciousness. The obvious implication, when the brain and body die, that's the end of conscious awareness. My coma journey showed me something very, very different from that. And it has to do with the fact that I had a severe bacterial meningitis. In fact, it's really the most perfect diagnosis I could have had to try and assess modern kind of views of near-death experiences and of conscious phenomena, and try and decide whether or not this all happened in my brain. Because my default position when I came back to this world was it had to be some kind of wild trick of the brain, of the dying brain, because it was way too real to be real. As I told my oldest son, Eben IV, when he came home from school 2 days after I got out of the hospital, having recovered from my coma, or at least started my recovery. I told him it was way too real to be real, and he, of course, gave me that sage advice, the best advice I've ever received in my life, which was, if you want this to be of value to anybody, write it all down before you read anything about near-death experiences or about physics or cosmology. And of course, my near-death experience had pushed me into a position where everything I ever thought I knew before, I now had to question tremendously. And the deepest part of that was that the brain creates consciousness. I can now tell you quite assuredly, the brain does not create consciousness. The implications of that are absolutely stupendous. This is all about how science and spirituality strengthen each other. And that's where this world is headed. And what I would predict right now is that pure reductive materialist science, again, that just says it's all just those workings of the subatomic physics, chemistry, biology of the brain and all, and that consciousness is an illusion, free will is an illusion, that science is on the verge of going the way of that thinking, oh, the earth is flat. Oh, the sun goes around the earth. Oh, the brain creates consciousness. When the brain and body die, it's all over. That kind of thinking is actually going away based on where modern science is headed. Part of that is an attempt to reconcile the enigma of quantum mechanics, which I'm not going to get into in any kind of detail at all, but suffice it to say it's very relevant to every bit of this. And that pure materialism in science, the materialist science that says there's no such thing as soul, spirit, or consciousness, that is what is doomed, because that view of materialist science is forever stuck at what's called the hard problem of consciousness, which in its simplest form simply tells you that there's no neuroscientist on earth who can give you the first sentence to try and explain how the physical brain gives rise to consciousness. And that is an earth-changing revelation in its own right. But I want to get back to my personal story and how I got to a point of these particular conclusions and why it is so solid in my mind that this is the direction everything is headed. And this is a direction that science is taking. But it also means that science goes from being kind of kindergarten level, very simplistic, reductive materialism that is tempting to the physicists and cosmologists out there to even think that they can talk about a theory of everything. One thing my journey showed me very clearly, human brain and mind will never have a theory of everything. So to any of you out there in the physics and cosmology world, I would just warn you, do not, put that little idea of theory of everything outside of your vocabulary, because it's just a guaranteed embarrassment if you get drawn into the hubris of thinking you've got a theory of everything. And of course, the problem is, as we get closer to any kind of theory of everything, according to some kind of skeptical, atheistic, scientific types, what you're doing is basically eliminating that God of the gaps. They would say that God is there simply to be the what we attribute anything we don't understand scientifically, we can say, well, that's because of God. And of course, in their view, as they get closer and closer to a theory of everything, all knowledge comes together, they know everything, and then God disappears. What I would say is, what does it look like if God is absolutely real at the core of all existence, at the core of each and every one of our consciousness? What if that is the case? What does that look like? And what I'll put out there and try and lead you to through the next hour is it looks a lot like the hard problem of consciousness. That in fact, with this decade of the brain and all the billions that have been poured into neuroscience research over the last few decades, we haven't gotten closer to an understanding of how brain creates consciousness. We've actually gotten further from it and further towards realizing that the hard problem of consciousness is the deepest mystery known to all of human thinking. So how did I get there? Well, again, it all started with my growing up in this family, believing science is the pathway to truth, having a conventional training in kind of modern 20th century science and neuroscience that took me a long way. Now, I'd grown up in that Methodist church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina that I told you about. I wanted to believe in that God. I wanted to believe in an afterlife. I wanted to believe in the power of prayer. But in that long career in neurosurgery, more than 20 years in academic neurosurgery, I just found it more and more difficult to explain how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And so, in fact, during those many decades, I would say that my faith was in great question. Now, those who've read the book will realize there's another part of my personal story that's very important. It was crucial in my understanding where all this was headed and in understanding the reality of my journey, which did not happen until more than 4 months after my coma. And that little personal feature of my history is that I was adopted. My birth mother was a sophomore in high school. My father was a senior in high school. And there was really no way for them to get together. And also, to the chagrin of my birth mother, she came to realize, even within a few weeks, that a 16-year-old unwed high school student was not going to be allowed to keep a son, and that in fact the social services were going to intervene and take me away. And she finally had to sign off on the papers when I was 4 months old that gave me away. Now, like most adoptees, when I was younger, I would write letters to the children's home in Greensboro, North Carolina. And North Carolina had very strict laws to try and prevent any kind of reunion. They would even, I heard cases where birth dates were altered just to make it tougher for anybody to reconnect. And so whenever I wrote those letters to the children's home, you know, any sign of my birth mother out there? Does she want to get back together? I always got the same answer, no. And I was okay with that. I could not have been more fortunate. I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family. You know, I couldn't have done any better in life. So I decided, well, you know, people made agreements back in 1954. They were just abiding by those agreements, you know, not disclosing anything, and that's it. I just let it go. And that's the way everything would have stayed. Now, in so many of our stories, there are those things that, especially some of the tragedies and hardships in life, that don't seem to make any sense at all when they happen. But then much later, everything falls into place, and one might start to suspect that maybe there was a divine plan, and it just wasn't apparent to us what that was at the time. Likewise, there are events that occur that are so kind of insignificant, you kind of blow them off as of no relevance whatsoever. That's like one event that is important here. That is the fact that my older son, Eben IV, was doing a school project in the year 2000. And that school project was on family genealogy. He was in the 6th grade in school in Dover, Massachusetts, when I was working up at Harvard. And I remember he came home and told me about this project on family genealogy, and I spun off a few other stories about our adoptive family history, and he said, "Dad, you just don't get it. This is about family genealogy, your biological heritage. We need to know more about your birth family." I thought I'd humor him, write another letter to the children's home, fully expecting I get the same old answer I'd always gotten before. Well, suffice it to say for now that when I got that answer in February 2000, it was not what I expected. I found out my birth mother was out there, but it was not a good time to come back in her life. And I didn't realize it literally for months after that, how big an impact that perceived rejection by my birth mother had on that phone call received driving down a snowy road in a blizzard to take my son skiing in February of 2000. But it turns out, others pointed out to me later, I had stopped taking my 2 sons to church. I stopped saying prayers with them at night. And only when all that was pointed out to me months and months later, I come to realize I had lost any remaining faith in a loving personal God or the power of prayer with that perceived rejection during that 2-minute phone call back in February of 2000. And that's the way things stayed for 8 years until my coma. And I can tell you now that what I saw, what I witnessed, the story I tell about that journey deep in coma changed my life forever. I will never fear death. I will never again go back down into that world of thinking that the material is all there is. I realize we are all eternal spiritual beings. That our connectedness with our soulmates, and when I say soulmate, I'm not just talking about that love of your life. It could be the spouse with whom you had a bitter divorce. You're both here to teach each other deep lessons. I came to realize that some who I had seen as my nemesis or my enemy before my coma, preventing me from getting things in this world I wanted to get, often were very dear soul mates. When you hear that, love yourself, which of course I came to realize also after my journey that some of the biggest problems on this world come from the fact that we don't love ourselves enough. And it's not about some greedy, selfish love. This is about really loving ourselves as that divine, eternal, spiritual being connected one-to-one with God at the deepest core, here to help our fellow human beings. Because it really is all about serving as a conduit for unconditional love of that Creator for the creation. And by doing that and showing that love, compassion, forgiveness, acceptance, and knowing that we are deserving of that infinite, unconditional love of that Creator, each and every one of us. And that can empower us to love others and to love our neighbors, to love our enemies. It really is all about that love. There's nothing else that matters in that realm. Now, I even struggled with how to put that into a scientific framework after I came back from my coma. Because my doctors had told me full well, because of my disease, because bacterial meningitis, especially the severe form I had, is such a perfect model for human death by wrecking the entire neocortex, the outer surface of the brain. That's the part that modern neuroscience would tell you is responsible for every bit of our human thinking. Everything that's happened to you since before you were born, that you can remember as your worldly experience of your entire life, according to modern neuroscience, demands that at least some part of that neocortex be functioning to be processing all those details of any kind of conscious awareness. That's what modern neuroscience would try to tell you, and that's a very good way of looking at this in terms of how to interpret my journey. Because in fact, the neuroscience that I knew before my coma, and this is what my doctors knew full well when I came back, should have completely disabled all but the most rudimentary forms of conscious awareness, and certainly wiped out any kind of memory of that. And yet, that's not what happened. And I want to tell you about the journey that did happen deep in coma. And I think it's important to point out that in that journey, when I did come back to this world, which was 7 days into it all, on the 7th day of coma, I'd been on a ventilator since they first brought me in the emergency room on a Monday morning, already in coma, seizing, and unaware of any of my surroundings, my neurologic exams showing the last of my neocortical function vanishing within the first hour in that emergency room, and it only got worse as that week went on. But when I did come back from that coma, everything about Eben Alexander's memories of my life before, all words, language, knowledge of this universe, of human beings and earth, and every bit of that was gone, completely deleted. I think that's one factor that some of the kind of would-be critics out there kind of miss, is just how sick I was. I was deathly ill, but with a perfect diagnosis in terms of one that would enable me to then go through the very prolonged analysis after the fact to try and understand how it happened, and end up concluding with my colleagues and with my doctors and with others who were deeply interested in consciousness, brain, and mind, that it could not have happened in my brain at all. This was not a dream, a hallucination, a drug effect, confabulation, because in fact the neocortex was so wrecked by this bacterial meningitis that none of those things could have happened, even though I spent months early on after my coma as my own worst kind of critic and skeptic, trying to explain it all as a brain-based mechanism. It was really my colleagues and the doctors who were there with me who helped to point out to me, no, your experience could not have happened in your brain at all. Get over it. Okay, well, then the question is, what does that tell us about the nature of reality and existence? And you can bet, although as was told in the introduction, that I wrote down those 20,000 words in the first 6 weeks and then started reading about near-death experiences, I was absolutely blown away, because I realized that my experience, the experience I talk about in Proof of Heaven, is one of millions of stories out there that are telling us the very same thing. And in fact, these are not just the stories from the near-death experience literature, which has, for the most part, come up over the last 60 years or so, ever since modern medicine came up with ways to resuscitate victims of cardiac arrest. And what we ended up doing over those 50 or 60 years, by resuscitating all those people, bringing them back, is we now have several tens of millions of souls that have been to the other side. And they realize that that little simplistic view that comes out of our materialist science that says brain creates consciousness, it's birth to death and nothing more, that view is woefully inadequate and simply false. And that's where science is headed. It's a much deeper end of the pool, I promise you. So what was it like deep in that coma? What was it that I went through that then shook everything I had ever believed at its very core and forced me into a whole new worldview that now makes far more sense? And I promise you, the medical and scientific communities take this story very seriously. While I was up in Toronto a week ago talking to the Department of Surgery, invited by the head of neurosurgery there. I've spoken to the American College of Surgeons, their annual meeting, other surgical groups, physician groups. It's because they realize what's going on here. This is about trying to get closer to truth. And it's not about either being spiritual or scientific, because in fact, we are every bit of all of that. And it's not a battle between them. And I promise you that pure materialistic science, if it insists that there's no such thing as spirit, soul, or consciousness, in my view, is forever stuck at that impasse of the hard problem of consciousness, which basically says no neuroscientist can tell you the first thing about how the physical brain might create consciousness, and they're stuck at the enigma of quantum mechanics, because that drove the founding fathers of quantum mechanics and quantum physics deep into mysticism, because their experimental results told them consciousness is this profound entity that should be more seen as the ruler of this realm. It's not some little epiphenomenon or illusion of the physical workings of the brain. And that's where it starts to get very interesting. And I promise you, this is where the world is headed. The world is waking up. That pure materialism of the 20th century, the scientific materialism, is doomed. Now, of course, I'm a big fan of that science, but also a much grander science, science with a capital S. And so I would not be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's why this is all very much a consolidation of what we can know about soul, consciousness, spirit, the eternity of all of that, the reality of our soul as existing beyond bodily death, and of our connectedness with each other in that realm and with the divine, because it's all together. So I want to take you back to what happened back in at 4:30 in the morning, November 10th, 2008. I woke up with severe back pain, much worse than I can put into words. Thought if I made it down the hallway into a warm bath, maybe that would help. Well, I almost couldn't even get out of the tub. Had to use a towel to pull myself up and out. And it turns out that I then barely made it back to my bed and collapsed in a writhing in pain in a cold sweat. My younger son, Bond, those who have read the book will realize that name is far more appropriate than I knew at the time. Bond, age 10, came in the room, realized I was in agony, and he started rubbing my temples, trying to make me feel better. As soon as he touched my head, I felt like he'd driven a white-hot spike right through my brain. Severe pain. And of course, anyone out there with any kind of medical training would hear about sudden onset of severe back pain, severe headache. Meningitis might come to mind. But the doctor was already out. My brain was being overrun by an extremely primitive and very rare infection that soon thereafter sent me into coma. In fact, what my family saw was they came back an hour or two later, found I was having a grand mal epileptic seizure. Called 911. EMTs came, put in some IVs, tried to break those seizures at home, were unable to do it. Took me off to Lynchburg General Hospital. Of course, I remember none of this. I was long gone from this world, and have zero memories of anything around me in this world for the next 7 days. But I was told about a lot of this as I was writing the book and trying to put the pieces together. And I heard from family and from doctors and nurses taking care of me what happened next. And that is that I got to that emergency room. And in fact, I was lucky to be seen by Dr. Laura Potter. I had worked side by side with Dr. Potter for more than 2 years in that ER because I worked there as a neurosurgeon. And she didn't even recognize me, even though she knew me very well. She just saw a 54-year-old white male in status epilepticus in extremis, trying to die right there on her watch. She knew if she didn't do things correctly right away, I wouldn't even get out of that emergency room alive. And she was the one who did that lumbar puncture, put the needle into my back, into that fluid space from the fluid around the brain and spinal cord, and out came thick white pus under pressure. She told me much later that when she saw that, she knew I was dead, because she knew by that time I had what's called a gram-negative bacterial meningitis. If you have that diagnosis and you go into coma in anything less than 24 hours, took me 3.5 hours. I was on an express train down. Those two factors alone give you a 10% or less survival from that illness. So that was the good news at the beginning of the week. It got worse, because in fact, the next day my doctors got a real shock. Microbiology reported back it was E. coli. Spontaneous E. coli meningitis in adults, somewhere less than 1 in 10 million per year. It's extremely rare. Almost always happens in newborns, very rare beyond the age of 3 months. I have to defend my level of maturity, which is an ongoing battle. I just have to live with that. And so it turns out that, as doctors will tell you who take care of such ill patients, by day 3, such patients are either beginning to wake up or they're dead. I really wasn't either. I was still on my ventilator. My older son, Eben IV, the one who was majoring in neuroscience in college, he got there the first night I was in coma. He walked in the door at 11:15, took one look at that corpse being ventilated 12 times a second by a ventilator. He knew his dad was already gone. So, of course, he was quite shocked when he actually heard sometime later that I was starting to come back. And then, of course, when he came and saw it with his own eyes 2 days after I got out of the hospital, and he drove there, it was the day before Thanksgiving, and that's when I told him it was way too real to be real, and that's when he gave me that great advice about writing it all down before I read anything. But he was absolutely shocked. He knew enough neuroscience to realize that I was in bad shape when he saw me that first night. Now, my family, as I report the book, came from all over. My younger sister Phyllis got there a little after Eben that night. She was the one who decided that somebody in the family would be there with me 24/7 holding my hand. And I also talk in the book a lot about Reverend Michael Sullivan, who was our very good friend and neighbor. At the time I was going to an Episcopal church, St. John's in Lynchburg. He was our neighbor 2 doors up. He was also the rector at that church, and he was there every day I was in coma, leading prayers with others, and there were prayer groups all up and down the East Coast and beyond. And I was not aware of those prayers in terms of seeing them in the form of the people around my bed praying, because I was never that closely in touch with this physical realm. But I did come to see, as I'll describe, the power of that prayer and how important it is. And I'm not saying that that is why I came back, because I think to explain why I came back, you really have to see that there's more to the overall big plan than I certainly knew at the time, and that it is part of that plan. I knew full well from my work in neurosurgery that often families, patients of mine with wonderful families, very strong faith in God and Christ and the afterlife, praying, and yet we were not able to have that patient come back to us physically. The point is that yes, the prayers are very important. The prayers do get in, but it's very important to understand that sometimes we're not meant to physically be healed from a given physical ailment in this incarnation. And that has to do with the lessons that we're here to learn and that we're here to teach, that our soul mates, our soul groups, we're all here to learn and teach. That's what I think all of this is about. And so much of it has to do with realizing that the hardships and difficulties in life, the challenges, and that certainly, as a healer, I'll tell you, includes illness and injury, Those are gifts. They're opportunities for growth of our soul. It's how our souls both learn the lessons and help teach our soulmates lessons about how deeply loved we are and the eternal connection that we all share with each other and with the divine, and that we are eternally loved by that God. Now, in my particular instance, as I said, I was put up on that ventilator for those 7 days, and I want to tell you what was going on in my view when I was in there. And again, important to stress that any of my words, language, memories of Eben Alexander's life before coma, all of that was completely gone. So in the beginning, I was in what I call this earthworm's eye view. And it was very primitive, kind of coarse, underground. It was like roots or blood vessels all around me. And I remember I could wonder, even though I had no words or language, what, where? Never with any of that curiosity was there the briefest flicker of any kind of answer. Some people used to ask me when I give these talks, was that ugly underground kind of earthworm eye view, was that hell or purgatory? I would think hell would be at least a little bit interactive. And this was absolutely nothing of the sort. There was zero there. And in fact, in looking back on it, I think it's the best consciousness my brain could muster soaking in pus, with the neocortex being destroyed by the severe primitive bacterial infection. That all the lab values, all my neurologic exams, scans, and everything showed that my brain was getting wrecked, and as my doctors kept telling me when I came back, you could not have had any kind of experience. And that's why the diagnosis is so crucial at understanding why my case has garnered such interest in the medical and scientific communities, not to mention the success of the book. But it has everything to do with the fact that the very simple explanations that are put out there in the medical world for near-death experiences fail miserably in trying to explain my case, mainly because my neocortex, the human part of my brain, was being so ravaged by this severe infection. Now, it turns out that that earthworm eye view, luckily, even though it seemed to last for a very long time, did not last forever. And I was rescued because this slowly spinning, pure, clear white light that had fine white and gold tendrils coming off of it. And as it came towards me, one of the best features was it had perfect musical melody. And it was by remembering the notes of that melody that I was actually able to re-enter that realm. And it's important to understand, a big part of my journey was seeing that music, vibration, sound, frequency has everything to do with our ability of our souls to transcend to higher and higher levels. And I saw that in multiple ways during my journey, and that's why my work today, my research, which is with Karen Newell and Kevin Cossey of Sacred Acoustics, is all about sound and how it can influence deep transcendental conscious states. And it has to do with music and vibration and frequency, although the specifics of what we do in Sacred Acoustics, and those who are interested, I would send to sacredacoustics.com to learn more about it, has everything to do with some very profound changes that we're trying to induce in the lower brainstem and with what modern neuroscience tells you is consciousness, to allow your conscious awareness to be freed up into a much higher form, which is exactly what I would say happens when brain and body die. I think it's one of the biggest surprises. That's why the near-death experience community, their reports are so interesting, because they've been trying to tell us by the tens of thousands for the last 6 decades that when you die, your awareness goes to a much higher level. It completely defies anything that modern science would tell you about the brain creating consciousness. And it's exactly what I saw, because the earthworm eye view, I think, is the best consciousness my brain could muster soaking in pus. Well, the next step should have been a state of nothingness. In fact, it was just the opposite. It was the blinders coming off and going up into a world, this idyllic valley, ultra-real beyond description. This gateway valley, as I call it in the book, lush, filled with life, very fertile. Everything was growing, even as you would witness any part of it, all growing, and I was moving through it because I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. Now, this was not a butterfly like some entomologist here on Earth could give you genus and species. This is kind of the the ideal form of butterfly. And butterflies and dragonflies are often messengers in this realm from that realm. But I promise you, in that realm, they're far more impressive. And to be a speck of awareness on that butterfly wing was especially amazing because there were millions of other butterflies all around flying in this great river of color and life, and we would swoop down into that lush greenery. And I can remember the buds and blossoms and flowers opening up with these rich textures, colors beyond the rainbow, every bit of it very dynamic and moving and alive in every full sense of the word. Ultra real beyond description. That part is very hard to put into words. Some people used to ask me, well, does that mean it's like high-def TV? Well, no. It's a way of knowing things where we have pure conceptual flow and become other beings, become entire aspects of the scene. In fact, at some points in the highest realms, in what I call the core realm, which is where all this led to the highest spiritual realm, I would become the entire multiverse in higher dimensional space-time for all of infinity as part of the lessons. Now, if you think that's hard to put into words in our earthly language, you're right. And that is, of course, a big problem with all of this. The journeyers who go there and come back try to put these incredible journeys into words that are derived from our earthly experience. That's one thing that I noticed in giving these talks when I started giving talks to rooms filled with near-death experiencers. It was very different. I mean, the communication with us even now goes far beyond the words that I am putting out there. But in that community, when you've got a whole room full of people who have been there, you find that it's much easier to convey exactly what's going on, and it doesn't get lost quite as much in this struggle to find earthly words to explain a non-earthly environment. And I think it's important also to realize that the differences between those journeys, for instance, that a Christian might see a beautiful all-loving light being as Christ, and a Muslim might see an all-loving light being as Muhammad, and an atheist might see an all-loving light being as some incredible, indescribable, all-loving light being of infinite power, but they don't know exactly what word to put on it. They're all seeing the same thing. And that's what the stories are like. When you can look beyond, and this is what shocked me so much, not just about the near-death literature, but going back into the afterlife literature, going back thousands of years, the writings of religious mystics and prophets back for thousands of years, they're all talking about the same thing. And it's absolutely real. And that's the part that's so shocking. In fact, I use the analogy in the book that the fact that we get kind of blinded in the garish light here of this reality, in this consciousness, to thinking the material world is all there is just like the situation where you can look up into the sky at night and see all the stars and galaxies and wonders of the cosmos and marvel at this wonderful creation that goes far beyond our words or understanding. But then the sun comes up in the morning, and in that garish light of day, you might be tempted to kind of forget what you know is really there. And that's exactly what our consciousness kind of illuminated here in this, birth to death, kind of very temporary moment in our eternal existence as eternal spiritual beings. It kind of looks like that. That it's hard sometimes to remember that, although there are many souls out there who have never forgotten it. Most children, of course, know it full well. It gets drilled out of them. They remember having been in that realm. And the other side of the coin is one thing I realized full well from my journey, and that is an absolute must if you want to really understand this at a deep level, is that our souls come back again and again as our ascendance proceeds. And that is something that is consistent with most modern and traditional religions, but also is consistent with Christianity. There's a beautiful book by Dr. Herbert Puryear, How Jesus Taught Reincarnation, which I think is a very important one. Obviously, Jesus knew everything about reincarnation. It's even mentioned in the New Testament and in talking about Elijah and John the Baptist and all. So it's not like it was a new concept. But the point of the matter is, if you think it's just birth to death and nothing more, or if you think it's birth to death and then eternal heaven or hell, it's very confusing. And yet tens of thousands of near-death experiences and other lines of reasoning show that reincarnation is something that explains a lot. For me, it was important in understanding how an infinitely powerful, infinitely loving God could allow the hardship and difficulty that we see in this world, the unfairness and injustice, especially the suffering of innocents like children and animals. And it made far more sense in realizing, as I did from my coma journey, that reincarnation is a huge part of the picture. It also turns out that there's a very powerful scientific literature on reincarnation. In fact, the arch skeptic and scientist Carl Sagan said that there were three kind of psi phenomena, as he called them, most important of which was past life memories in children that had so much evidence for them they demanded a far richer explanation of what consciousness is. But if that doesn't take the materialist view of brain creates consciousness and chuck it out the window, I don't know what does. It's very important to understand how this is all coming together. Well, it turns out that in this beautiful valley where I was, on this butterfly wing, below us, lots of souls dancing, lots of joy and mirth and merriment, and that was all fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of light, golden orbs, leaving sparkling golden trails, and emanating these hymns, chants, anthems coming down, power beyond anything I could ever imagine in an earthly hymn. And that's what I was labeling weeks later, writing it all up, that these were angelic choirs. And that's exactly what I believe they were. And yet they provided yet another musical portal up into higher and higher realms. As I saw this whole realm collapse, time as we see it here, collapsing into Looper Point, there was a deeper time, as I call it, the time of that gateway realm of our souls between lives, where the causality is very clear and our souls are on a journey of ascendance. And that was a crucial part of my understanding of this. That and those angelic choirs provided yet another pathway up into that core realm, the infinite inky blackness filled to overflowing with the love of that divine, that infinitely loving power, creative source at the origin of all that is. And with this brilliant orb of light and the sense of the three of us there, and being told that I was not there to stay, that I would be coming back, but I would be taught many things. And from that realm, I did tumble back down into that earthworm eye view, and that was something I didn't understand for the longest time. But the good news is I remember the musical melody of those notes of that spinning white light, and that's what allowed me to ascend back up to that gateway valley on the butterfly wing, time after time. And every time, the most beautiful part about it, the message that I bring back to all, was given to me by a beautiful girl beside me on that wing of the butterfly. And of course, she ended up being the key to my deeper understanding of it all. But that took me 4 months to understand after I came back, as I describe in the book. Now, it turns out that I cycled through those realms multiple times, always being told you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. And of course, I'd come to think going back was the earthworm eye view. So no problem. Remember the notes of the melody, and I get to go back up. And this beautiful girl on the butterfly wing always gave me this perfect message of unconditional love. And it's the message that I like most to bring back to this world is the central message from the book Proof of Heaven. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. Of course, in the book, there was a third part, which is you can do no wrong. The big reality is when we realize we're here to learn the lessons, that the lessons have to do with manifesting unconditional love, loving ourselves, loving our neighbors, loving our enemies, that it's all about that love. As long as we're following that pathway of love, then fine. But if we choose to do otherwise, and I believe that God gives us that gift of free will, if we choose to do otherwise, to hand out pain or suffering to others, then we're just there to learn the lesson. We either learn it in this incarnation or we learn it in the life review that we have when we leave this physical incarnation, in the presence of our higher soul and our soulmates, going through that life, reliving all the goods and bads for any residual lessons we're still to learn, and having to feel any of the pain or suffering we might have handed out to others. We have to feel it just as they did, but even more so, because we're feeling it in that realm, in that life review. There's no need for an eternal hell when we have to go through that. But know that the lessons are all about that love. In fact, I would say love and light are what fill this universe. It's not a battle between good and evil, darkness and light. But that it's real, that darkness or evil is simply the absence of that love. And that's what each and every one of us can do, is serve to bring that love to ourselves, to our fellow beings. This is not just about humans. It's not just about life on earth. It's far bigger than all of that. And that is a part that, again, leads some of the skeptics and those totally bought into scientific materialism to kind of miss the boat on this. But it's a very important part of the understanding. Now, it turns out, as you'd imagine, that there came a time when the gates were closed. They promised me that. You're not here to stay. And that's what happened. There came a point where the melodies no longer worked to bring that spinning white light and that served as a portal up into that beautiful realm with that lovely girl on the butterfly wing. But in fact, it didn't work anymore. And that's when I felt tremendous sadness, but I also trusted. I knew I'd be taken care of. And in that setting, what I ended up seeing were arcs, thousands of beings around me going off into the distance. And they're all kneeling. There was this incredible energy coming from them. To me, it was a very shocking energy because it was filled with the same love that I'd seen in that gateway realm and the beautiful idyllic valley so filled with life, with that beautiful girl and all the dance souls down below, angelic choirs above, and also in that core realm, the infinite inky blackness, the sanctum sanctorum of the divine, with a being so powerful and overwhelming and awesome that when I came back trying to write it up, the word God was way too puny, a little human word that didn't do justice at all to something far beyond any human words or description. That's why I often call that deity Om in my first writings, because that was the sound that I heard there. Now, of course, over time I came to realize that that's what many would refer to as God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh. I don't care what the words are. The words are confusing. They get in the way. They make it sound like we've got a little high school debate going on here, and you know the last box is none of the above. But that's not the way it is, because in fact it's that myth of thinking that the boundaries separating those religions and separating religion and spirituality from science, those boundaries are false. They're man-made boundaries. They come from our linguistic brain. They have nothing to do with the true teachings of the prophets. And that's what this is all about, is coming back on the right track after a few millennia of having people distort and twist the message that came from those prophets. And realizing that we are all one in the truest sense. And anyone who uses religion to try and say we're separate is misusing the teachings of those prophets, because that's never what was intended in the original teachings. We are all one. And not only just human beings, but this is all oneness that we share with all other creation, not just on this earth. Now, to try and pull all this together, I think what I'd like to point out is when I did come back from this, I faced a long and arduous struggle. I was trying to explain it as a brain-based mechanism, but because I had severe bacterial meningitis, in working with my colleagues, we were coming to realize this was not a brain-based phenomenon. What I had been through was far too real to be real. And then, of course, as I read tens of thousands of near-death experiences, I came to realize millions of other people, by extension, have been through the very same thing. Way too real to be real is the way it's described in more than half of those cases that are reported. And it's a very hard thing to put into words, but it's a shocking reality about what is truly going on here, about the nature of our conscious existence. And as I wrestled with all of this and wrestled with exactly what is consciousness, in fact, it's the only thing any one of us truly knows exists. So it's far more important than just some epiphenomenon or illusion that the materialist scientific world would try and convince you that it is. And wrestling deeply with every bit of that, as I read the near-death experience literature, I came to realize there were some big shocks for me, because I was knowing by this point there was something deep and powerful going on in these journeys and NDEs and everything that's told about them that tells us something fundamentally important about our existence. And yet the more I read, the more I realized, well, my father should have been there. My father had passed over 4 years before my coma. He was nowhere to be found in my near-death experience. Likewise, that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing, I'll never forget her face, how she was dressed, how she was sitting, those beautiful thoughts of perfect, loving oneness coming into me, of unconditional love. We were loved and cherished deeply forever. Every bit of that. How come I didn't recognize her? I had no idea who that was. I remember her face perfectly, yet I knew I'd never met her in my life. And those were very haunting problems. And in fact, they were crucial at my understanding, because what happened, as I describe in the book Proof of Heaven, is when I was wrestling with all of this, about 4 months after my coma, everything came together. And to tell you how that happened, I have to remind you of that story I started at the beginning about my adoption. But it turns out that after that perceived rejection in February 2000, when I lost all faith and became agnostic for 8 years before my coma, it turns out that it was 7 years after that, 1 year before my coma, when my sisters walking on a beach in South Carolina said, well, don't you think it's time you reached out to your birth family again? My first thought was no, because I remembered what a death spiral that had sent me into in terms of my faith and everything else. My whole life had started to unwind after that perceived rejection. But they were right. And so I reached out again, wrote another letter to the children's home. This time I got a positive answer. And that's kind of a long and beautiful story in its own right. But suffice it to say for now, October 5th, 2007, I met my birth parents. I hugged them for the first time in 54 years. And then the next day I met my brother and sister. And then after that I met extended family, and they've met my adoptive family. We've all gotten to be very close. It's a beautiful story. It was always a little bittersweet. And that's because of what I found out in 2000. Driving down that snowy road was actually the social worker telling me that my birth parents got married. That was a tremendous shock. I cannot put into words what a shocker that was. And not only that, that they had 3 children, but that my youngest sister had died 2 years earlier in 1998. It was therefore not a good time to come back in their lives. That's what sent me in such a tailspin. And that was the bittersweet element, was the fact that I met this birth family and got to come and know them beautifully, and yet realized that there was that daughter who they really didn't talk about very much, who they had lost. They were still grieving, tremendous pain. But I do remember that when I met my birth sister, Kathy, in 2007, about a year before my coma, she promised to someday send me a picture of Betsy, the sister who had died in 1998. That picture arrived 4 months after my coma. And I remember pulling that picture out and looking at it, and she had emblazoned this poem across it, When Tomorrow Starts Without Me. Beautiful poem written by David Romano, and it's in the book Proof of Heaven. And I remember reading that poem, my eyes just filling with tears. I put that picture up on my dresser and just was sobbing, overcome with emotion over the tragedy of losing this sister, the sister I never got to know in this earthly realm. And the next morning I was reading in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, Life After Death, that beautiful story about a 12-year-old girl who had a profound near-death experience, deep in coma, in which she was welcomed to that heavenly realm by her brother. And he showed her that same unconditional love that my beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing had shown me. He helped her to make a decision to come back. And when she came back to this world, she mentioned it in talking with her parents, especially with her father about this, said, but I don't understand. I don't have a brother. And he said, well, you did have a brother, but he died 3 months before you were born, so we never told you about him. I looked up on my dresser, that picture I just got the day before, and I recognized that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing. And I cannot tell you what a powerful revelation that was. It reached across all dimensions and shocked me into realizing the nature of my journey and where I had been. It's almost like she was looking at me in the picture. Do you finally get it? So I would just like to close by reminding you of that beautiful lesson that she gave me that I brought back to you. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. Thank you very much for your attention.